Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kenneth Oy. I'm a professor of political science and data systems at MIT, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this forum and also to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Neil Ruiz of the Pew Research Center. By way of background, Neil has worked on ethnicity and race and immigration at George Washington University, Brookings, World Bank, and Asian Development Bank. But more importantly, Neil earned his doctorate in political science, MIT 2014. So in keeping with his upbringing within MIT as a good MIT geek, his talk today will focus on evidence. Neil will provide the demographic data, crime statistics, and public opinion survey results that are needed to inform deliberation on the very sensitive topic of anti-Asian hate. So I'm going to stop there, and please join me in welcoming Neil Ruiz back to MIT. All the applause, Neil, you can hear in the background, but we'll move to you now and look forward to your talk. We'll obviously be following with question and answer, and questions and answers should be entered in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Neil, thank you for returning to MIT.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's great to be back again. And I've always enjoyed being back at MIT, even though this is virtually back at MIT, but I miss the campus, and I always enjoy seeing how so many changes, and it'll be interesting once the pandemic is over to see how it has changed. But so today's talk will be focusing on between the data, the unseen stories of Asian Americans. As we've been hearing and seeing reported around in the news, a lot of hate crimes have been occurring and being reported, and we're really trying to understand through evidence and through data what is going on here in the United States. We know, before I begin that, I just want to give you a little bit of background of Pew Research Center. We're a nonprofit fact tank. We're a think tank, but we call ourselves a fact tank. We're nonpartisan, and we don't make any policy recommendations, so we're non-advocacy. But what we do is really provide the voice of the people. That's our surveys, our demographic data, just facts, because we believe that facts are our foundation for democracies to function. And that's what we provide, whether it's not for any purpose, but to just the truth. So most of our funding, we are a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trust, which is over about a $6 billion endowment from the Pew family. And they've been giving a lot of money, or focused on informing the public and a lot of different philanthropic giving. But that's Pew Research Center is one of their big investments that they focused on to really be this fact tank for the United States and around the world. So, and we're also research programs. So I lead the race and ethnicity research team, but we have various issues that we cover, from US politics to science to even methodology and religion and internet. But let me turn to my talk. I'm going to be before I begin talking focus on the United States, we really need to understand the global landscape. All of us, of course, are all remote. We've all been shocked. The whole world has really just changed because of COVID-19 outbreak. And what I want to give you is a data point from our global attitude survey that we did last summer in advanced countries around the world on views of China. This is something that Pew Research Center has been tracking over the years. And it was really, for the first time, we saw this huge drop of evaluations of China, having a more of a negative, unfavorable view of China across the advanced world. You see this big drop just really between 2019 and 2020. And most think China has done, when we ask publics around the advanced countries, that in 14 different advanced countries, that China has done a bad job handling COVID-19. Though at that time, this was again, summer of 2020, they thought they were doing better than the United States at that time. So we don't know how it is currently, because we don't have a new survey results for that, but this was back in summer again. But then you also see a lot of negative assessments of China based on the coronavirus response. When we ask a question about, has China done a good or bad job dealing with the coronavirus outbreak, you see here across the board, except a few like Italy, mostly all majority say they've done a bad job. And then We also noticed that what is contributing to this negative view is really the handling of the coronavirus outbreak. So those who said they had an unfavorable view of China, we looked at the data to understand what did they answer among the publics around the 14 countries around how they were doing, how China was doing in terms of handling of coronavirus outbreak. And we noticed really everyone says that they've been doing a bad job, those who said unfavorable. So there really is this correlation between the unfavorability of China and also what people believe their handling of the coronavirus outbreak. So that's a little bit of the global context. Let me bring you now to the United States in this comparative landscape of race and ethnicity. So much has happened. 2020, it was not even more than just COVID-19, but also racial reckoning in the US. And we did the survey right in the middle of it in June, right when from the killing of George Floyd, June 4th through June 10th, we did a survey of a national representative survey of US adults. Our Asian sample, unfortunately, is only of adults in English, meaning they were interviewed in English. So it may not be fully representative of all Asian Americans, but just to give you an idea, about 4 in 10 Americans say it's more common for people to express racist views about people who are Asian than before the COVID-19 outbreak. You see this really high for Asian Americans in particular, but you also see it also high for Black Americans. And then we asked a battery of questions. And what we found was that Asians and Black Americans are more likely than other groups to report negative experiences because of their race or ethnicity since the COVID-19 outbreak. So you could see 39% of Asian adults reported people acting as if they were uncomfortable around them. 31% of Asian adults say they've been subject to slurs or jokes, and 26% say they feared someone might physically attack or threaten them. But let me now turn to today. So we did a survey just this month, and I wanted to, as we were seeing more reporting about anti-Asian crime and seeing the horrific videos and what happened in Atlanta and in New York and really a lot of metropolitan areas in the United States, we really wanted to understand in our current American Trends Panel, our surveys, what is going on, what is among Asian Americans. So we found that 8 in 10 Asian Americans say violence against them in the United States is increasing. So Asian adults believe this increase of violence towards them. And when we ask those subset of those who said, we did what we call an open-ended question. So Asian adults who said that the 81% who said this had been increasing, we said, what are the main reasons in your own words? And what we found when we coded all the words that people said is that 1 in 5 US Asians cite former President Donald Trump as one of the reasons for the rise in violence against Asian Americans. But you also see racism, COVID-19, as well as Asian Americans being blamed or scapegoated. But what's interesting here, I want to give you 2 quotes from a couple of respondents. One from a woman, 29, who said that, who said, quote, the main reasons is a mix of coronavirus news and its origins in China, coupled with talks regarding race inequality. Asians are not accepted as people of color, as they are seen as a model minority, but they also they're also seen as foreign because they are not white. Another quote, ignorant people placing a blanket blame on Asians regarding the origin of the COVID-19. Racism against Asians has always been present and is generally caused by other groups, both whites and Blacks. So more findings from this survey, we found that nearly half of Asian Americans experienced an incident tied to their racial or ethnic background since the pandemic began. Again, that same question we asked almost a year ago now, we found that Asian adults have experienced at least one of the 5 incidents, more than about half, and 1/3 fear someone might threaten or physically attack them. 27% said that people acted as if they're uncomfortable around them. And also, again, same being about over a quarter have been subject to racial slurs or jokes. But we also did see that someone expressed support for them, about 1/3. And this survey was done again in really the beginning of this month, between April 5th and 5 and 11. But discrimination against Asians is nothing new. we were able to trend the question that we've asked on our surveys here at Pew Research Center. And we found that we asked the question, have you personally experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly because of their race or ethnicity? And those who said regularly or from time to time, it's been about 3/4, consistent from when we asked the same question back pre-pandemic in February 2019, during the pandemic, beginning of the pandemic in June 2020, and now in this month. So there's virtually the same in terms of it's just nothing new. So now let me turn to demographics of Asian Americans. Asian Americans as a whole racial group are the fastest racial group or ethnic group in the United States. And where is this coming from? So first, I wanted to give you a background on the immigration history here in the United States, a very brief one. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. Before that, those who immigrated, Asians and those from Latin America were not allowed to immigrate into the US. It was 1965, which was a pivotal moment. And you saw then from that moment, we saw a huge increase in terms of the percentage of the US population that was foreign born. So currently about just 14% of the population now are immigrants. And then if we want to go back in history, we saw 3 different waves of immigrants that came to the US, right? So in the middle of 1800s, we saw a Northern European wave. In the Southern European Eastern wave was more in the late 1800s. And then now in this current wave since 1965, we see that a new wave of immigrants, which is mostly composed of Latin Americans and those coming from South and East Asia. So what's interesting here, here's a map of the US with the top immigrant group, the top origin immigrant group by state. And you see in 1960, before 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, you see, okay, Mexico is the top immigrant group in California, Texas, because they border Mexico. But you saw in Hawaii, it's Filipinos. You see that in Canada and actually in Canada as well. But you could also see that in Germany, Germans were also part in Minnesota, Wisconsin. So it's very interesting. People from England or Britain, Great Britain, are in Florida, right? So, but what happened by 2013, you saw the top immigrant group very different. You saw that Mexican Americans were quite broadly majority of American states, a top immigrant group. But you do still see Indian Americans. You see in New Jersey are the top immigrant group there. Chinese Americans in Pennsylvania, and you see Filipinos in Alaska and Hawaii. But there is a new change in immigrants, the destinations of the source of immigrants coming to the U.S. Since 2009, there have been more Asian immigrant arrivals compared to those who are Hispanic. So this means that there are bigger flow of Asians, those immigrating from Asia than from Latin America. So what does this turn to? We see Asian Americans are now the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the United States. So between 2000 and 2019, we saw an 81% increase of the Asian American population in the United States compared to Hispanics, which grew about 70%, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders about 61%. And just to give you a little bit of background, the census since 1997 separate Asians and then Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So we use the census categories in our analysis here. And then the population, actually the Asian population in the US is projected to pass 35 million by 2060. So this is a real fast growing population. Asians are also projected to become the largest immigrant group in the United States, surpassing Hispanics. So by 2065, you'll see here, Asian immigrants will be much greater proportion of the immigrant population than those who are Hispanic, white, or Black. But then at the local level, this is actually kind of interesting. Where are the Asian American population growing fastest? We found in our analysis of the census data between 2000 and 2019 that North and South Dakota have actually had the greatest rate of over 200% of increase of the Asian American population. And that's actually driven a lot by Filipino Americans. But you also see in large states, raw numbers, of course, California, Texas, New York, you did see a large increase. But I do want to note Georgia, which was a key state, and a lot of people want to understand that since the flipping of the Senate, that a lot of people always think that Asian Americans played a big role in how that turning Georgia into two senators to become Democratic. And also just in terms of electorate, the electorate, you see that also Asian Americans are the fastest growing electorate because of their growing in terms of population, but you also see they're now either being born in the US and turning 18 and being qualified to be eligible voters in American elections, or they were immigrants who became naturalized citizens. And what is unique about Asian Americans is that compared to Hispanics, Blacks, and whites, the Asian electorate, the Asian eligible voters, 67% are foreign born. So they grew up, they were born somewhere else, immigrated to the United States, naturalized, and then were able to vote in the United States. So this is very unique for Asian Americans in general compared to other racial and ethnic groups. So now let me turn to between the data. So we're talking about Asians as a whole, as a one racial group, but there's a diverse group with different origins and economic circumstances. A lot of times people make the mistake of really lumping everyone together and it's easy to do that, to talk about averages and talk about Asian Americans as a monolithic group, but there's wide diversity. And here are the data points to show that. The big 6 Asian origin groups, Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, they make up 85% of the nation's Asian population. But there are more than 19 Asian origin groups that are less than 2% of the population that really we don't see. So this is one interesting thing when we think about doing a survey or polling. For instance, when you want to poll Asian Americans, or US adults, it's quite challenging because just imagine Asian Americans are about 6% of the US population. If you do a national representative survey of about 1,000 people, you're only going to yield about 60 Asian Americans, right? And of those 60, can you say that they could speak for all Asians, knowing that you have this wide diversity? And let me show you why that matters, because each ethnic origin group is very different. And one interesting data point before I get to the differences of disaggregated data among Asian Americans, we see also how do Asian Americans self-identify? Those who identify single race, non-Hispanic Asians versus those who are multiracial. We see from the census data, from our analysis of the census data, we see 83% only check Asian, right? So they're single race self-identified. But then we also see 14% of Asian Americans are multiracial, and about 3% are Hispanic Asians. And what's interesting about multiracial Asian Americans, you see that Japanese, 33% of Japanese Americans identify as multiracial. And you see that Filipinos and Koreans as well are pretty high in terms of having a multiracial makeup. And also in terms of generations, is young. The Asian American population in the United States, you see that the biggest generation now is Generation Z and post-Generation Z. And it's really big for US born Asian Americans. You see that about 60% are Gen Z or post-Gen Z. And then you could see among foreign-born Asian Americans, you see that Gen X, my generation, the Generation X is actually the largest among foreign-born Asian Americans. And I remember I showed the map of the top immigrant groups, and here is a nice map that we were able to put together here at Pew Research Center on the top Asian origin group by state. So you see that it was very interesting. Hmong Americans are the top Asian American group in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where you see Filipinos in Alaska and Hawaii, Indian Americans in Texas and Florida, and Chinese in Oregon, New York. So it's kind of very interesting to see this wide variety of who's the top Asian origin group in each state. Another interesting data point is that immigrant shares vary by Asian origin group. What do I mean by that? Those who are foreign born, right? So Bhutanese Americans, 85% of Bhutanese are foreign born, whereas Japanese Americans, the large majority actually US born, only 27% were born abroad. So you could see this very big difference of origin by Asian origin by country. and also by income. So a lot of people will say, oh, Asians are doing really well. They are, the median household income is $86,000 a year. That's much more than the US household income and median household income. But look, there's a big wide differences. Indian Americans are very high, and we have to remember Indian Americans historically come into the US and are selected by our immigration system because of their high skills. The H-1B visa program is very popular, which requires a bachelor's degree to come into the US and work for an employer, which is usually in tech or in higher education. They have high income. That makes sense, about 119,000 median household income. Whereas if you're Burmese American, you came into the United States as an escaping violence, and you became, a refugee. So very different circumstances. You were selected because you were escaping your country and coming in as a refugee, and their household incomes are about $44,000 in terms of median household income. And also this translates to a wide range in terms of poverty rates. So you see Mongolian Americans and the Burmese have a much higher poverty rate compared to those who are Indian, Filipino, or Japanese, and also as Asians as a whole. So this is very important to understand that there's this diversity. Not everyone is doing well. Not as everyone is high income earners. Just because you're Asian American, you're doing very well. Another point in terms of education, when you look at the aggregated data, you could say, oh, US Asians are 54% have a bachelor's degree or above. So everyone must be doing really well. But when you disaggregate, you see, well, there are big wide differences. Bhutanese, Laotian, Hmong, Burmese have much lower educational attainment compared to Indian Americans, Malaysians, Korean, and Chinese. So this is very important to really understand, because if you are trying to develop programs for outreach for Asian Americans in a different state, and the composition of your state has more different groups there, you really make sure that you won't, you need to understand who's there to make sure that you're providing services as well, or really trying to understand the demographics of your Asian population. And what's interesting here is another analysis that we did about a couple of years ago, looking at the various racial and ethnic groups. We found that Asians have the highest income inequality in the United States. Between 1970 to 2016, the top Asian earners, so the top 10% of income for Asian Americans, is 10.7 times more than Asians earning in the bottom. This is more than any other racial and ethnic group. And again, it really highlights from the previous slide of the diversity again of the income brackets for various Asian origin groups. But what's interesting here, just to elaborate more on this slide, you see that from 1970 to 2016, the top 90 percentile income earners for Asian Americans have really grown from 68,000 in 1970 to over about 130,000 in 2016. But the bottom 10 percentile of Asian Americans really haven't grown in terms of their income from 1970 to 2016. So this is really important to understand. And also Asians in the top half, the member of the income distribution, are actually moving away from whites since 2000. So this graphic is telling us it would be parity in terms of income earned to whites if it was, but you see that Asians overall at the top, actually at the top distribution, actually much higher than those who are white. So what does this bring to? Like yesterday, we released at Pew Research Center a whole data, all these data sources. So here's a website where you could find all the data sources. We have all these fact sheets from each Asian origin group, so you can really understand the demographics. It covers what percent are in multi-generational households. It covers all various, even deeper data that we could understand. And we made it as easy as possible, as simple as possible, so that people could understand the different demographics of the various 19 Asian origin groups. And more can be found here. And then, but there are still unseen stories. So I talked about this problem of doing survey research. I only really just scratched the surface with the survey data that I was able to report out earlier. Again, as I said, they're only from Asian adults who are English speaking. That's what we were able to do in our surveys. But we know that in order to do a proper nationally representative survey of Asian Americans, you must have in-language support. The reason why you must do that is because Asian Americans have a high percentage who are foreign born. And in order to do that, you must, many don't have English proficiency, especially certain Asian origin groups. And you must have, if you want to reach out to and provide the voices of the multitude of voices among Asian Americans, you have to do it in language as well. So what I'm saying here in my message is that there are unseen stories about this diversity of the Asian American experience. And there's so much more to do to really unravel these diverse voices. We at Pew Research Center, I'm leading this whole initiative where we're trying to understand Asian Americans and their immigration experiences, economic mobility, and identity. And what do I mean by those three core themes? I really believe that there's how people came into the US, whether you came as a refugee, where we saw the data points for Bhutanese, but you came as a high skilled immigrants like we saw for Indian Americans, really is your starting point in America. Everyone makes this broad assumption, and this is where the model minority myth is there, that, oh, Asians are doing really well. Because again, as I showed, the top 6 largest Asian origin groups are actually doing really well, and they represent 85% of all Asian Americans, but they don't speak for everyone. So how do you provide the voices of everyone else? So what we're doing is really trying to do an expanded survey combined with qualitative research to reach out to the harder to reach Asian origin groups to really tell their story, to provide this rich data. And really want to show how the immigration experiences may be impacting their economic mobility, the varied economic mobility in the US, and also try to understand identity. We don't know much. We know a little bit that in past surveys, people more likely are to identify with their country of origin - American. So like myself, Filipino American or Chinese American or Indian American, rather than the big, broad Asian American identity. But there's more to ask. Who represents you? Who do you, what are your political views? We know that Asian Americans from other researchers show that there's wide variety. Indian Americans are more likely to be Democrats, whereas Vietnamese Americans are more likely to be Republicans, which is actually similar to when we do our work on Hispanics. You see that Cuban Americans are more likely to be Republican, whereas Mexican Americans are more likely to be Democrat. There are certain things about the immigration experience, where you came from, because I think Vietnamese, similar to Cubans, are leaving. They were leaving communist states. They didn't want to be part of that. They don't like big government. So that's probably impacting their views here in America. And that's something that we hope to explore more to really understand this diversity and really provide the full voices of the landscape of racial and ethnic landscape here in America. So I will end there. This is my contact information, and I believe that my PowerPoint will be passed around, but you can look at Pew Research Center, pewresearchcenter.org for all our research, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. So I just wanted to draw people's attention to the Q&A button at the bottom. And please do enter your questions there, but also feel free to upvote the questions that you think would be most deserving of attention. To give folks a little bit of time to continue to enter questions, Neil, I'm going to actually kick this off with the hardest question I can come up with for you.
It's
So
MIT fashion.
Yeah, general exams revisited. No, but the first part of your talk really did talk about the common experiences of Asian Americans, particularly during this period of, let's call it COVID, and concerns over China. And the last part went through the extraordinary diversity of Asian Americans when you look across groups. The question that I have really is partially, why is it that we're seen as the same? If you look not amongst us, but at the rest of society, and why it is that you believe, not the survey says, but you believe that anti-Asian violence has increased. I'm going to give you 2 little stories about this, and it picks up on this theme, frankly. I talk with a friend who comes out of a social work background, working in Dorchester and in Lowell. And here you're talking about poorer immigrants who are dealing with, let's call it, problems that are at the bottom of the heap in terms of SEC. And they report terrible experiences, being singled out, increases in acts of violence and increases in, let's call them the casual comments. On the other hand, I just was in contact with a friend who is a Korean American, married to an MIT alum, living in the western suburbs of Boston. And she was crossing a street in Boston. Now, come on, all of you alums understand how dangerous it is to cross streets in Boston. You're in the crosswalk, and of course, cars cut close. This is Boston. But typically, the drivers do not pause and shout an ethnic slur at you and tell you to go home, and then cut it really close. She did not report this to the authorities, but frankly, that's as clear an example of anti-Asian hate as you can come up with. Top of the income bracket, bottom. So Neil, not survey says Family Feud, Neil's views. First, do you believe that hate crimes are increasing against Asian Americans? And do you believe the data, basically? But two, why do you think they're increasing?
Those are great questions and tough ones. And it's, for me, just looking at the, literally yesterday we had an event with our report, and then we had the person, Russell Jung, who's been collecting all this from Stop API Hate and the data that he's been collecting about anti-Asian hate that's going on, that we've been seeing in all the reporting. And I guess first off, I'm a data guy, so I go back to our surveys. I know that you want my own opinion, but first off, I think what's going on here, you see that it presented to frame the conversation about these views of China, right? I can't make that connection yet, but I want to. We missed the boat in asking a question about around the world, because I think this could possibly not just be an American thing. It could be, and I've been hearing from people, and Neil, can you add in your global surveys about anti-Asian around the world? Because that could be people misconception or correlating with anger for China, the COVID-19 towards China, towards people, right? So from a research standpoint, we're trying to get at that, right? But I think for the increase of anti-Asian violence, our survey questions were asking Asian adults if they feel, do they see it increasing, right? So people are telling us it's legitimate, they're telling us that, right? The crime statistics, I think some people say it could be, is it really new or not? Has this always been there? And I think, even I'm going back to the data point I presented earlier, I think discrimination is nothing new. It's now being more reported, I think. And I believe that people are more, we are probably still missing a lot of statistics, because I can imagine, like, my parents who are foreign born, they're more likely not to, report it if someone says something to you. I know what happens to me personally. I'm not speaking as Pew Research Center, but I personally, when someone, just to give you perspective, I was giving a talk in Charlottesville maybe a year after what happened there. And then I was walking and someone called me, a racial slur, but I don't report that. So in a survey, I would have said, yes, that has happened to me, right? So I think, but then I don't think people report that as crime. So I think that's really interesting. And I don't know if people who are foreign born or people who don't speak English well, like, remember, they might have even a worse time, maybe more crime happening to them, but they're not reporting it. And I just hear this, these are still research questions that I have in my mind, because I hear, like, everyone was talked about after what happened with George Floyd, everyone said, okay, what is a talk you'd give to your children, right? For Black Americans to say, I have to give a talk to my children and say, don't, when a police stops you, you have to be careful, follow, just in case, to be careful, right? What am I hearing? I was trying to figure out this is still unanswerable questions, but I was wondering, I was hearing a voice from my parents, like, just be careful, don't just walk away, or just be quiet, do well, do your own thing, or walk away from it. So a hypothesis could be, there could be much more than even being reported now going on, because there's a lot of data points that we don't know. So I think that's where I'm at. I'm still, like, I'm still an MITer. Like, I'm not sure. I have built thinking hypotheses, and I really want to understand it. But yeah, these are all possibilities that could be happening. But at least our surveys are showing people believe that it has been increasing, and they've experienced it themselves.
We'll turn to Joe to serve as the producer of the talk show, harvesting questions from the Q&A, harvesting questions that have been upvoted a lot. And I'm going to ask Joe to go on the air with his rich baritone voice and pose those questions on behalf of alums. Joe.
Thank you both, Neil and Professor Roy. Linda asks about New York City and the Bay Area in particular. Neil, any particular insights more specifically about those two metro regions that do, trend more Democrat in general?
I mean, yes, they do trend more Democrat, and I know that we've been hearing a lot of reporting from those two cities in particular. But yeah, they do trend more Democrat, and I think I don't know. I mean, these are still unanswered questions. Why is this crime happening more in even the most Democratic states, right? Is it just how the data is being collected? It's in big cities, right, compared to out in the rural areas or in the suburbs, right? So that is still a question, like what is the universe of the data that's being collected, right? So there are probably a lot of things that are underreported. I mean, these would be questions for Russell, from my understanding from his work, but I think that this is a data collection endeavor or a universe issue.
Great. Jennifer asks about how you define Chinese in your surveys. For example, your charts include both Hmong and Chinese. How would you count a person coming from one of the Hmong communities within China?
Yeah, so when we do our, it's all self-identified. So we ask them, and using the census data and the way they ask the question, we ask them, what do you most identify as? We don't want to be placing identities on people, but people telling the census same way they would tell us. But Chinese is interesting because it is also very diverse too. We know that there's a big wave of people who came from Taiwan, right? And we know that there's a one China policy, and we even know even the government statistics itself is very sensitive of how they report that out, because you have mainland China, but you also have Taiwan and Hong Kong, but then even how people self-identify, it's a very sensitive issue. Just so you know, for us, we treat it with what the census gives us, so that's how we did our analysis. But in research from the analytical standpoint, I like to treat them separately, because I know that Taiwanese will probably have a very different view of China versus those who are from mainland. And just to give you an example, also, just to give you a little more disaggregated data, even Chinese Americans themselves are very diverse. The reason why I say that's because those who immigrated to the US from the 1960s were leaving communist China, right? They didn't want to be part of it. Whereas Chinese Americans who immigrated in the last 10 years, they grew up and benefited from China's economic rise. And they're coming as foreign students, and they have a very different perspective and could have a very different perspective. So I think that is something that I hope to explore actually very soon, because I'm doing some more work on that. But I think that will be something to really understand, because I know that even these buckets of racial, these ethnic, even countries of origins could be problematic, and there are also diversity within them. And that's something I really want to explore as well. And I think it's important to do.
So Neil, you mentioned countries of origin in your last remark. A question, okay, if we look across Asian Americans as disparate groups, our parents and grandparents, folks back home, often do not have the best feelings about each other. Okay, you look at Chinese and Korean attitudes towards Japan in the legacy of World War II, and Filipinos. And the legacy of hatred is quite intense. Vietnamese are known to be moderately suspicious of the intentions of the People's Republic of China, and on and on and on. In fact, I think Pinoys have been beaten up by every group in East Asia at some point. At the same time, if you look at Asian Americans in the United States, and we all face a certain degree of common discrimination, to what extent do the fights of the parents and grandparents carry over to the immigrants and descendants of immigrants in the United States, in terms of everything from political attitudes, the possibility of forming coalitions, and even intermarriage?
Those are great questions. And from what we know from research, at least other researchers who've been really looking into this on Asian Americans, I've noticed that, especially Vietnamese Americans are actually very interesting comparing them with other groups because they're highly more Republican, more conservative. Um, and again, as I said earlier in my talk, there's something to do with being a refugee, leaving Vietnam, and don't without wanting the role of the state, like wanting basically more of a free market. I don't like big government, right? Which I said was similar to kind of Cuban Americans. I think that what's interesting here is that you're right. My parents, for instance, I heard many stories from my own parents because they lived through World War II in the Philippines when their house was actually being bombed. And then for much of my own childhood, they were saying, don't buy Japanese, right? It was very interesting. Like that was what I heard. But then over time they changed, right? So my parents have changed. Now they have a Japanese car, but then they're proud to say it's made in America, right? So and then you know this because you guys did all this work also at the performance at MIT Industrial Performance Center, understand made in America. But this is really interesting how people have those views. But those are the stories I've heard, and I know many people have those stories, right? Japan, even if you go to the publics in Japan, not in America, we know that there have been for a long time negative views of Japan for a while after World War II. So these do carry over in some way, but then I think here in America, you're right, there's something else going on. Like I presented the survey data earlier as one racial group, if people are being treated in the same way, it's a, I guess you want to call it being racialized by outsiders also are forcing you to be part of a broader community of experience of this having a similar experience. So I think that is something that I really want to explore even more. This is really, again, scratching the surface, but I think there's more to learn about how that do people now, because of, if maybe to even take a subset of those who experience discrimination, do they identify more as Asian American versus those who, or those who didn't experience discrimination, would they be more identifying with their country of origin? That would be kind of like a research question right there that we would see if there's a difference. Again, going back to, this is our political science training from MIT coming in. So, okay, you're muted.
Another question, Neil, from Jose Luis. How are Asian Americans doing in corporate America? Has representation increased in the C-suite, board of directors, et cetera?
Those are great questions. We had someone in the panel that I've been speaking to, folks from business leaders, and all the people are telling me, we don't have a survey, unfortunately, so it's not representative, but anecdotally, what people are telling me that, yes, this is an issue. I hear that people have been trying to get more representation of Asian Americans in corporate. Silicon Valley in particular has been talked a lot about in the news. We heard that a lot if you saw the news about the new Biden and Harris administration, where people were saying, people were talking about how why wasn't there a cabinet member who was Asian American Pacific Islander? So these are things that I think is on top of mind a lot of people. I think this is, again, another research question that I would love to ask everyone, because I think it would vary, right? One thing that's interesting that I think, just to problematize what it means to be Asian American, who represents Asian Americans, right? Ask ourselves the question. So, and this is a great question, and I don't know the answer. Vice President Harris, she's multiracial, self-identifies as Black American, but also of Indian descent. Is she Asian American to people? Like, if we ask that question to Asian Americans, we don't have that answer, right? But or do people think regionally? Are South Asians different? We know they're different. South Asians are different from East Asians, from Southeast Asians. Everyone has very different experiences, different foods, different norms. And again, is the umbrella Asian American stronger in terms of people identifying more with, rather than their countries of origin or the regions? Is there something more common among regions? So just problematizing more, these are still hypotheses or things that worth to explore in future research, but it is, yeah, these are interesting questions that we still have yet to learn.
And a similar question about professional development, I imagine your answer would be the same, but in the context of professional development, like the rate of promotion compared to other race, ethnic groups, et cetera, you'd say the same?
For that, I'm not familiar too much with those statistics, but we do hear I know that some folks talk about the bamboo ceiling. I just have heard that in Silicon Valley a lot. And there's been some reporting on that by some other organizations that have been tracking that.
A lot wondering about the term people of color and how that plays into the semantics in your survey design and so forth, and reporting.
Yeah, again, when we do the reporting, we ask we, as you can see, we broke it down by racial or ethnic group, or by adults who were answering the questions on those, and also the census data. Also, we break it down by that. But that's an interesting question. Like, as I gave that quote, who's the person of color, right? So I think that is. I mean, I don't know the answer, and it would be a great question to ask the public, and then break it down by race and ethnicity to really understand who they think is part of that community. But because sometimes we all do it, right? We say, okay, everyone who's not white, right? Non-white, that's everyone else who's people of color. But as you can see, some of those intricate, it's very much more complex. Like that one quote I gave from one of our respondents in our survey and our open-ended questions really said, Asians are not first people of color, but they're also, foreign. So they're not white. So there's this also forever foreign mentality as well that people may have about Asians. So is that a person of color, or is it just completely different? And again, also people also may look at the general statistics. Oh, Asian Americans are doing well on average, so therefore they don't need any help or any special attention or anything. But you saw from the data, people, especially those Asian Americans who came as refugees, they're in much different sort of economic circumstances. And a lot of times what I'm hearing from a lot of philanthropic givers and also civic organizations, they're telling me that a lot of they're not getting the services because a lot of even policymakers are making decisions based on national statistics. Whereas if you look at local statistics, a lot of them are probably below the poverty line. But possibly no programs are being reached out, or anti-poverty programs are being reached out to them. So those are the things that I'm hearing, but these are things that we still need to explore. And I think policymakers need to understand the basic facts, and that's what we're hoping to do. This data that I presented is really just to really help us understand the demographics and really dispel the idea that Asian Americans are not just monolithic. They're not one. There's such a diversity of economic circumstances.
A lot of questions about higher education, and Professor Roy, I imagine you have opinions about this too. Admissions, in college admissions, should there be changes to admission policies in schools to reflect new emerging data? What about leadership in higher education? And how about academia in general, specifically STEM, academia, engineering, science? Any thoughts on that?
So let's talk about that with specific reference to MIT. I kind of glanced at the Q&A and noticed that there was a question directed to me on that. MIT is not perfect, but let's talk about what goes on at the Institute in many of these categories. Starting with undergraduate and graduate admissions, but make it undergraduate first. Compared with other institutions of higher education, MIT tends to be, I would argue, less committed to things like alumni preference, a popular topic within this group to be sure. But I'm mentioning that right off the top, because when people are discussing undergraduate admissions and arguing about preferences, they typically leave out discussion of a factor that has powerful effects on the racial composition of schools. Before coming to MIT, I taught at Princeton University. And the alumni preference there was really strong, but it had explicit effects, frankly, on the composition of the undergraduate student body. Its history, its legacy, and the word legacy is in fact applied to that. And because MIT starts with every tub on its own bottom, individuals get in on their own merits, that makes a huge difference in terms not only of the composition of the class, but also the characteristics of the place. People take pride, frankly, in being MIT students and graduates because they know why they're there. And frankly, such is not the case at other elite institutions of higher education. Second point, in terms of faculty. So I'm a first generation college guy myself. My parents never had the opportunity to go to college. I'm not an immigrant, but my parents did suffer more than their share of discrimination being locked up in prison camps during World War II. And I'm obviously an Asian American. And I have to tell you, compared with other places where I've been, I have felt that MIT has been more open, okay? More open in the sense that when I look at center directors and department heads, and I haven't ground the numbers through, we should be looking at availability pools and percentages as the US Department of Education will require. I haven't done those systematic studies, but I can tell you that my sense is that MIT is pretty good on these matters, is not discriminating. And I know that MIT, for example, was not targeted for investigation by the Department of Education on Title IX. Okay, so what's going on here? And I hate to praise anything about a school that I'm teaching at in front of an alumni association because it sounds so pandering, all right? But I actually have talked to people about this. And one of the things that I heard from federal investigators, why are you not coming after us? Is that MIT has tended to be a little bit more honest, not in claiming or not being perfect, but pointing to issues that require attention, pointing to potential flaws, and then saying we're looking into it, revealing the data, even if the data may not be fully making you look good. And this is particularly true in terms of gender discrimination and sexual harassment. But again, Chuck Vest and Raphael and Susan and others stand out a little bit from their counterparts because in their heart of hearts, they are kind of MIT geeks saying, let's look at the data. We can't act on problems without knowing. And I almost fell off of my chair when a federal investigator told me, well, we're going after Harvard, but we're not going after MIT because when you have problems, you talk about them and you get the data out there. And that was not a public conversation. It wasn't an official announcement, but there's something in there about how you approach issues and problems. Again, it's not a claim that we're perfect, but I am kind of struck by a little more honesty and a little more engagement on matters of race, ethnicity, gender at MIT relative to other places that I've been. So Joe, come up with a question out of chat for someone else, if you don't mind.
Sure, Neil, feel free to weigh in. But another question from Linlin, maybe around criminal justice here. Any observations on the race, demographics, income, education of people perpetrating racism against Asians or Asian Americans? We assume they're white Americans when we hear about racism against other races. Linlin says, I'm Chinese American and have experienced racism from non-white people too.
Yeah, it's a mix. I think some of the data is actually, and you've been seeing the reporting, it's actually non-white against Asians. Many of those you've seen as well, the videos. But I'm not sure. I still grapple with that data. I haven't analyzed it well, and I'm always worried. I always worry about the universe to make sure are we collecting in rural parts and suburban parts and other parts? Because then, so you get the wider net, because cities also tend to be more demographically diverse. So if you want to generalize for all of America based on just New York City or San Francisco, I wouldn't want to do that because the demographics are very different from other parts of the US. So if you want to get a national level, you have to have national statistics, right? And then a lot of it right now is in different cities. So, and remember, demographics are different if you try to generalize from the whole universe. So that's where I would say be careful. But going back to your previous question about affirmative action, I give you the example of Chinese Americans. This is where I'm hearing from folks, and this is something that we hope to explore, that affirmative action, that let's just put it, Harvard, what happened there, just across the, actually not across the river, next to MIT, they've had the whole big case there. And a lot of really driven by Chinese Americans, but it's not all Chinese Americans. You have to remember it's most likely, which I still have to study that and learn more, is recent arrivals, those who, because they think that and there's been this movement of not disaggregating the data. So I presented all this, I'm not an advocate here, but I always love data. Data, like an MIT geek, we love as much granular data you have, the more we have to analyze, right? And tell different types of stories. But there's been a movement, no, just put it as one group. Don't disaggregate between Chinese and Hmong and other groups, because then it would discriminate against Chinese Americans, right? So that's what some people are arguing. So there's been this movement in a lot of states, actually in the last couple of years, to not disaggregate data, have governments just keep it as one racial group, so that they would say, oh, because you don't want them to distinguish, like I just did, showing all the variety of wider income brackets and wider educational attainment. So that's what people are telling me. This is something that we'll probably explore more and try to understand why, what people are thinking. I don't have answers there, but those are anecdotal stories that I think are research questions that we're learning about.
Okay, Joe, do you see other tough questions, brutal questions in Q&A?
Lots and lots of good questions. We will not do justice to them all. But you know, we might close on Mark's good question here. Is there research out there, Neil, that you know of or that you want to do on what on the causes of this discrimination and violence? Does it develop from other stereotypes? How it's kind of couched in other mindsets too?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So this research program that I lead at Pew Research Center, we're going to be doing more work on this. So I'm excited to do more in-depth work on Asian Americans, but also doing more work on Black Americans, as well as our work that we've longstanding on Hispanics and other rarer populations in the US. This is something definitely that we want to explore. It takes more in-depth research, and as we know from MIT, and I said Pew Research Center is not very different, more data and just good research is what's important. And I think that is something we definitely want to explore and try to understand what are the roots of this, what is going on, when does someone become racialized? I mean, there's some questions that I have, like, we know Black Americans, we assume no, there's a growing population who are Black immigrants in the US who have very different economic circumstances than those who are descendants of slaves in the United States, for instance. Very different economic circumstances. And what does that mean? Do they identify more with the umbrella Black American? What does it mean for African American identity? What does it mean for or their origin dash American identity? These are questions that we're going to explore and ask them in their own words and ask their voices in, national representative voices, to help us understand what is going on. So I'm excited about the work that we're doing, and thank you for having me, because I think, the training at MIT really did it. Like, I have to say that I love this. I know, Ken, I'm advertising for course 17, but doing social science at MIT was very unique. And I think that I learned so much there that have been really applicable to the work that I'm doing here at Pew Research Center. And I'm just so happy to be part of MIT.
Well, listen, Neil, thank you again for returning to give this talk. In terms of teasing you about being a typical MIT geek, the Pew Center actually deserves special mention in that regard as a generator of information, as a generator of data. Not presupposing answers, but doing the digging and putting the money into getting answers instead of speculating. This is not Family Feud. It's not survey says in terms of a weird little subset. The efforts to try to gather systematic answers to questions in terms of finding out what the attitudes are is a first step towards better understanding. But Neil, thank you again for returning. And we're hitting the witching hour, time for everyone to go back to their jobs after their lunch hours. Thank you to all of the alums and that were here today, and to staff for pulling together this forum.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.